Dr. John Newman is a professor at the Buck Institute and at the University of California, San Francisco. He hopes to translate what we are learning of the pathways that control aging into therapies to improve the health and independence of older adults. And with that, let me start the interview. Hello, Dr. Newman. You are a professor at the Buck Institute and also practice gerontology at UCSF. So welcome to Modern Healthspan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here. Looking forward to our chat.
So, Dr. Newman, can you introduce yourself very briefly? So you do have this dual role as both a researcher and a clinician. So that would be really interesting to understand kind of what you're doing in those two roles.
Yeah, I'm a geriatrician physician scientist. You're not going to meet too many folks like me. So I do both clinical work. I teach. I practice medicine. I'm a geriatrician, which means my practice focuses on the special needs and problems of older adults. I'm actually mostly based in the hospital, so I help to take care of older adults when they're admitted to the hospital, and would love to talk more about how that informs my science, what problems I'm interested in, and how I'm trying to use basic science to create better tools to help older adults, help them to stay independent and to live their lives as best they can. But I'm an old-fashioned physician scientist. My laboratory, my research programs do everything from very basic science, biochemistry, through preclinical models, mostly using mice, into translational science, trying to see if the stuff that we're studying in mice and test tubes is actually relevant in people, and trying to use what we've learned to better understand problems that are important to people. And for me, that's all focused on aging and geriatrics. And my mission in life is to take the incredible, exciting science that we're learning about the basic mechanisms, the biological mechanisms of why we age, and try to translate that into a better understanding of the problems that affect us as we age, and hopefully create new therapies for them, especially the ones that are so difficult to understand and treat because they're so complicated. Geriatric syndromes like delirium that are a big focus of my lab. So I do it all. I do it all with a purpose. Advance the science, hopefully eventually influence clinical practice, and help to train the next generation of folks so there's more people like me who can do this translational work.
So why ketone bodies as your focus?
Ketone bodies are a really interesting angle on aging biology, and I can talk about why are ketone bodies related to aging. And I can tell you a bit about why the personal story. Why am I interested in ketone bodies, which is actually a bit of an accident. Kind of how do scientific careers develop? There's a lot of serendipity and coincidence involved. But ketone bodies and aging. Why is this? This is interesting for several reasons. Your readers are probably familiar with some of the basic outlines of aging biology, I'm guessing, including the close relationship between mechanisms of aging and diet and nutrition, or the patterns of nutrition. So many of your listeners will know that the very first experiments that showed that you could take a healthy animal in the laboratory, rats in this case, and make them live longer, and not just a little bit longer, quite a bit longer, like 30-40% longer. Those experiments were first done almost 100 years ago. And what is this? This intervention, this fantastic drug that made a healthy rat live longer? It was eating less. It was dietary restriction. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. It's not just eating a little bit less. It was eating a lot less. It was eating almost to the edge of starvation. But dietary restriction made rats live longer. And now there's 100 years of data in all sorts of organisms. It's more complicated than it sounds, but in general, the surest way to make an animal live longer is some form of dietary restriction. We've learned, though, that it's not about eating less. This is one of the most exciting parts about aging science.
This video is brought to you by BiOptimizers. Magnesium is a crucial mineral for hundreds of reactions in the body and impacts everything, including sleep and muscle and bone health. It is difficult to get sufficient magnesium through our food. In our efforts to remain fit and healthy, my wife and I frequently exercise, after which it's important to recover well and get restful sleep. To help us with this, we chose Magnesium Breakthrough from BiOptimizer because it blends all 7 essential forms of magnesium into one effective supplement while also using all natural ingredients and being gluten, soy, and lactose free. It has improved our recovery and sleep quality since we've been taking it. And we are happy to tell you that BiOptimizers are offering a 10% discount for Magnesium Breakthrough to Modern Healthspan audience. Just go to www.magnesiumbreakthrough.com/modern or click on the link in the description to get a 10% discount with coupon code MODERN10. Thank you for your support.
It's not about eating less, but researchers all over the world have been able to map out how nutrition signals into our bodies, into our cells, to control mechanisms that relate to aging. It's signals. It's all regulated. We can understand those pathways, and then we can intervene on them. And understanding those pathways, things like autophagy and proteostasis and AMPK signaling, these have actually led to the first generation of drugs that are in clinical trials to target aging. So it's all signals. Here's where ketone bodies come in. So anything that you do to eat less, to fast, caloric restriction, dietary restriction, intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding, all these things that get at that nutrient signal bit in aging, they mostly put your body in a state that makes ketone bodies. Now, is that a coincidence? Does that just help us to survive fat? Ketone bodies help us to survive a fast. We need them. But is that the only role that ketone bodies have, or is it more than a coincidence that all these states that make animals live longer, you're making ketone bodies? Do they actually have a function? Are they part of the mechanism? And I think we're learning more and more that they might be part of the mechanism. We know that ketone bodies interact with aging biology in a number of interesting ways. And this is what my lab now mostly focuses on. I'm sure we'll dive into it in more detail. Are ketone bodies part of the mechanism through which fasting and dietary restriction affect aging? Can we understand that in detail? Exactly what do ketone bodies do that relate to aging? And how can we apply that to specific problems and diseases in aging, like Alzheimer's disease or delirium or heart failure or others?
Can we take a step back and just talk a little bit about ketone metabolism? Ketone metabolism in general. And certainly do want to dive into ketones and aging. So can you talk a little bit about, why do we produce ketones and what are they used for when they get produced?
Ketone bodies are one of the ways that our bodies use fats for fuel. So one way to think about ketone bodies is, they are to fats what glucose is to carbohydrates. They're really simple molecules. Your body makes them from much larger fat molecules, but they're small, they're simple, they circulate in the blood, and many different cells and tissues can burn them for energy. So they're how our body accesses all of the energy that's stored in our fat. If you're fasting, if you're starving, you haven't eaten anything for days, how do you survive that? Where do our bodies store energy? We start with carbohydrates. We have a little bit of glycogen stored in our muscles and our livers, but we burn through that pretty quickly. Most of the energy reserves in our body are in our fat. Ketone bodies help us to access that. And so they keep us alive when we're starving or during a fast. They also help to keep us alive without having to burn too much of our muscle to do so. Ketone bodies feed the brain so that we don't have to turn muscle into sugar to feed the brain. That's thought to be the evolutionary reason why do ketone bodies exist. They help us to survive long periods without food and help us to stay relatively strong while we're doing it. But there are other aspects to ketone bodies too. We make a lot of them when we're fasting, but we make them all the time. Our bodies are always making a little bit of them. And compared to other things in our other molecules in our blood, there's actually quite a bit of ketone bodies there always. There's a lot more when you fast. They're kind of unique among among molecules in our bodies in the range of normal is so wide, because you can have 10 or 20 times more when you're fasting. So ketone bodies are just part of normal life, of our normal life. Many of your readers might have encountered them in maybe bad circumstances too. A lot of us have heard of like ketoacidosis. That's a bad thing. If your body's control of ketone bodies is totally out of whack, you can't regulate them anymore because you don't have any insulin. You're a type 1 diabetic. You can just get into, you start making ketone bodies out of control. And like anything out of control, that's bad and can become life-threatening. So, there's a dark side to ketone bodies too, if they're out of control. But ketone bodies are also just part of normal life.
It's not a binary switch, is what you're saying, is that you can have both ketones and insulin and glucose in the blood at the same time. So I guess it's not like this metabolic switch where you just go from one to the other.
Well, in normal physiology, so not talking about type 1 diabetes, in normal physiology, these things are on kind of a seesaw. Mm-hmm. So if you're eating a lot, and you have lots of glucose coming in, your body's making lots of insulin, you're not making as much ketone bodies. You're always making some, but you're not making very much. Then if the seesaw flips, if you're fasting, your blood glucose starts to drop, you're starting to use your glycogen, you're starting to make glucose. You have very little insulin, you're starting to make glucagon. Now you start making more ketone bodies. So in general, insulin and ketone bodies are on this kind of seesaw. And we'll talk a bit later about, and so that's normal physiology. If that doesn't work that way, that's what type 1 diabetes is. If you don't have any insulin ever in type 1 diabetes, then your body doesn't know to stop making ketone bodies. And so it gets out of control. We'll talk later about some of the interesting kind of new technology that's being developed to be able to take ketone bodies like a drug, take them, or like a food, instead of relying on your body to make them, to essentially eat them, which is an interesting approach to try to study ketone bodies in humans to see if they can affect these problems of aging.